Jungkook caught crying after a press conference, but no one knows why. As Jungkook's official meeting ended and he stepped into a private hallway, surveillance cameras caught something unexpected. After a brief phone call, the video clearly showed him staring at his phone, unable to hold back his tears, streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking with emotion. The transition from public calm to private breakdown took less than 2 minutes. The truth behind Jungkook's tears shocked anyone who thought they knew what was driving him. Something was about to be revealed that would challenge everything people thought they knew about the man behind the public persona. Though none of the journalists in the room could have predicted that a routine press conference would be followed by a moment of such raw human emotion that it would redefine their understanding of what drives someone to extraordinary levels of success and sacrifice. The week that followed would bring revelations about hidden acts of compassion that defied explanation. Yet these extraordinary events would remain completely private, never reported by any media outlet despite occurring in full view of security cameras. The press conference room at the HYBE headquarters in Seoul was filled with the usual mix of entertainment journalists, financial analysts, and industry reporters who attended these quarterly updates. The atmosphere was professional but relaxed, as these regular briefings had become routine events that rarely produced unexpected news or dramatic revelations. Jungkook had arrived at the podium precisely on time, carrying the familiar folder of notes and charts that he used to guide his presentations. His appearance was professional and composed, showing no signs of the personal emotions that would soon surface in such an unexpected way. The lighting in the conference room was carefully arranged to provide optimal visibility for both in-person attendees and the cameras that would broadcast the session to remote viewers. Everything about the setup reflected the professional standards that had become expected for these corporate communications. The press conference had proceeded routinely with Jungkook, answering questions about album sales, upcoming music projects, and strategic direction for his creative ventures. The presentation had been professionally managed, with the typical mix of artistic explanations, financial projections, and forward-looking statements that characterize these regular updates for investors and media representatives. The first 30 minutes of the session had focused on tour production numbers and fan engagement statistics, with Jungkook providing detailed explanations about stage design improvements and performance efficiency gains achieved during the previous quarter. His responses were thorough and confident, demonstrating the deep technical knowledge that journalists had come to expect from these briefings. Questions about his philanthropic initiatives had occupied another 20 minutes of the session, with discussions about upcoming charity events, creative collaborations, and progress toward long-term cultural impact goals. Jungkook's enthusiasm for global outreach was evident in his detailed responses, though his demeanor remained professional and controlled throughout. The financial portion of the presentation had covered revenue projections, investment priorities, and market expansion plans that would guide operations during the upcoming quarters. Jungkook had addressed analyst concerns about competition and industry challenges with the systematic thoroughness that characterized his approach to public communications. Throughout the hour-long session, Jungkook had maintained his usual composed demeanor, confidently addressing challenges from reporters and providing detailed responses to complex questions about creative timelines, artistic innovations, and market conditions. Nothing in his public presentation suggested any emotional distress or personal concerns beyond standard professional pressures. The Q, a portion of the session, had been particularly productive, with reporters asking substantive questions about artistic direction, industry regulations, and strategic partnerships that allowed Jungkook to demonstrate his comprehensive understanding of the entertainment landscape. One reporter had asked about team management and creative staff satisfaction, prompting Jungkook to discuss hiring practices, workplace culture, and the importance of maintaining morale during periods of rapid growth and high-pressure production schedules. His responses reflected genuine consideration for the welfare and health of his team. Another line of questioning had focused on environmental sustainability and touring, where Jungkook was able to provide extensive data about carbon reduction achievements and renewable energy integration across his various productions. His command of environmental statistics and sustainability science was impressive to the journalists present. The final questions of the session had addressed innovation timelines and research priorities, allowing Jungkook to share insights about emerging performance technologies and creative projects that would shape the future direction of his work. His forward-looking perspective and optimism provided the kind of content that journalists valued for their reporting. As the formal session concluded, Jungkook thanked the attendees for their questions and participation, maintaining the professional courtesy that had characterized the entire presentation. His closing remarks were brief and focused, providing no indication of the emotional moment that was about to unfold in private. However, when the formal Q&A session concluded and Jungkook left the podium, security camera footage from the adjacent building captured something unexpected as he stepped into a private corridor for a moment before returning to his scheduled meetings. The internal surveillance video showed him clearly crying with tears visible on his face and his shoulders shaking with emotion. The transition from the public conference room to the private corridor had taken less than 2 minutes. But the change in Jungkook's emotional state was dramatic and immediately apparent to anyone viewing the security footage. The composure he had maintained throughout the press conference had completely dissolved the moment he was alone. The private corridor was a secure area that connected the conference facilities to executive offices, designed to provide privacy for executives moving between public and private spaces. The security cameras in this area were monitored only by building security personnel and were not connected to any public broadcasting systems. The intensity of Jungkook's emotional response was striking to security personnel who observed it in real time through the monitoring systems. His tears were not brief or controlled, but represented a significant emotional release that suggested something profound had occurred to trigger such a reaction. The security footage was only viewed by building personnel and Jungkook's security team, who were immediately concerned about what could have triggered such an emotional response immediately after what had appeared to be a successful and routine press conference. The contrast between his professional composure during the presentation and his obvious distress afterward was stark and puzzling to those who witnessed it. The timing of Jungkook's emotional breakdown was particularly concerning, as it occurred within minutes of completing a high-profile public appearance. The possibility that something during the press conference had triggered such a response required immediate investigation, though review of the footage showed no obvious external triggers. As Jungkook stood in the private corridor, his tears continued flowing for several minutes. He made no attempt to contact anyone or request assistance, suggesting that he was processing significant personal news rather than responding to any immediate threat or emergency situation that required intervention. The intensity of his emotional response was striking to observe through the security cameras. His shoulders shook with the force of his crying, and he leaned against the corridor wall for support. The raw emotion was completely unlike anything that had been witnessed from him in professional settings. Between his tears, Jungkook could be seen checking his phone repeatedly, as if rereading a message or reviewing details from a conversation that had just concluded. His behavior suggested that he was processing information that had profound personal significance and emotional impact. The security investigation revealed that Jungkook had received a phone call during the brief transition from the public conference room to the private corridor. The call had lasted approximately 3 minutes and had originated from a number associated with a family he had been assisting with personal matters. The phone call timing correlated directly with the onset of Jungkook's emotional response, indicating that whatever news he had received during that conversation had immediately triggered his tears. The conversation appeared to have contained information that required both immediate emotional processing and continued reflection. After several minutes of crying, Jungkook could be seen taking deep breaths and attempting to compose himself. He wiped his eyes and checked his appearance, clearly preparing to return to his scheduled activities while still processing whatever news had affected him so profoundly. The security cameras captured Jungkook's gradual transition from intense emotion back to professional composure. The process took nearly 10 minutes, during which he moved between emotional release and deliberate attempts to regain control of his feelings and physical appearance. During his composure recovery, Jungkook made several additional phone calls from the private corridor. The conversations appeared brief and seemed to involve sharing news or coordinating responses to whatever situation had triggered his initial emotional reaction. The investigation revealed that the phone call had been preceded by several text messages from the same number over the previous week, suggesting an ongoing situation that had been developing rather than a sudden emergency or unexpected development that had caught him completely off guard. Jungkook's emotional response timeline indicated that he had received significant news within the first few moments of the conversation, followed by an extended discussion that had continued throughout his emotional episode. The pattern suggested good news that required detailed explanation and discussion. As he worked to regain his composure, Jungkook could be observed practicing the kind of breathing exercises and mental preparation techniques that suggested he was deliberately preparing to return to his professional responsibilities. Despite the emotional impact of whatever news he had received, the security footage showed that once Jungkook had composed himself sufficiently, he spent additional time in the corridor reviewing his schedule and messages, apparently ensuring that he could fulfill his remaining commitments, despite the emotional disruption he had just experienced. When Jungkook finally emerged from the private corridor, his appearance was professional and controlled, showing no obvious signs of the emotional episode that had just occurred. His ability to transition back to professional demeanor demonstrated remarkable emotional regulation skills developed through years of managing personal and professional pressures. The investigation into building access and communication systems confirmed that the phone call had been conducted using standard encrypted protocols and showed no signs of external interference or surveillance. Whatever emotional response Jungkook had experienced was based on legitimate private communication. Review of the press conference footage revealed that Jungkook had shown no signs of emotional distress during the public session, indicating that his professional composure had been maintained throughout the presentation, despite whatever personal concerns he may have been carrying. The contrast between Jungkook's public and private emotional states suggested someone who had developed sophisticated mechanisms for compartmentalizing personal concerns while fulfilling professional responsibilities. Though the intensity of his private response indicated the emotional cost of such compartmentalization, security protocols required that any unusual emotional incidents be investigated to determine whether they indicated security threats or personal emergencies requiring intervention. The investigation concluded that Jungkook's response represented a private matter rather than any situation requiring security action. The phone call analysis revealed that the conversation had been with someone whose number was registered in security databases as belonging to a family that Jungkook had been supporting through personal difficulties. The identification provided context for understanding why the call might have triggered such an emotional response. Jungkook's security chief privately approached him about the incident, concerned that there might be a security threat or personal emergency that required immediate attention and support. The emotional display was so uncharacteristic that it raised questions about whether something serious had occurred during the brief private moment. Rodriguez had worked with Jungkook for several years and had never observed such an intense emotional response, which increased his concern about the potential significance of whatever had triggered the reaction. His professional responsibility required him to ensure that any threats to Jungkook's well-being were identified and addressed appropriately. The security protocol for such situations involved discreet inquiry about the circumstances while maintaining respect for personal privacy and avoiding any actions that might create additional stress or complications. Rodriguez approached the conversation with the sensitivity that such situations required. "Mr. Jeon, we noticed that you seemed distressed after the press conference," Rodriguez said carefully during their private meeting. "We wanted to make sure there wasn't any security concern or emergency situation that we need to address. Is there anything we can do to help or any additional precautions we should take?" The inquiry was phrased to show concern for Jungkook's well-being, while also gathering information about any potential security implications of the emotional incident. Rodriguez needed to understand whether the situation represented a personal matter or something that might affect broader security considerations. The truth behind Jungkook's tears was revealed during their private conversation when Jungkook explained that he had just received a phone call containing unexpected and deeply moving news about someone important to him. The emotional reaction had been triggered by information that had nothing to do with business pressures or security concerns. "I just got word that Dorothy Kim is going to be okay," Jungkook explained to his security chief. "She's been battling a serious illness for months, and I've been quietly helping with her medical expenses and supporting her family. Her husband just called to say the latest tests show she's going to make a full recovery." The explanation revealed that Jungkook's tears had been tears of relief and gratitude, rather than distress or sadness, indicating that he had been carrying worry about Dorothy's well-being and had just learned that a life-threatening situation had resolved positively. The emotional release after receiving such good news explained the intensity of his reaction. The revelation about Dorothy Kim's illness and Jungkook's private support for her family provided context that transformed the security team's understanding of the emotional incident. Instead of indicating a problem or threat, the tears represented relief and gratitude about positive news regarding someone he cared about deeply. Rodriguez realized that the emotional intensity he had witnessed reflected the depth of Jungkook's personal investment in Dorothy's well-being and recovery. The fact that he had been carrying this worry privately while maintaining his professional responsibilities demonstrated a level of personal compartmentalization that was both impressive and emotionally demanding. Dorothy had been a stage technician for his performances for over 6 years before her health issues had required her to take extended medical leave, during which Jungkook had been privately ensuring that her medical expenses were covered, and her family had financial support. The phone call had informed him that her treatment had been successful and her prognosis was excellent. The background information about Dorothy's employment history and her relationship with Jungkook helped Rodriguez understand why her health situation had been such a significant personal concern. Her 6 years of service had apparently created a personal connection that went beyond typical employer-employee relationships. The fact that Jungkook had been privately managing Dorothy's medical expenses and family support revealed a level of personal generosity and involvement that extended far beyond normal workplace benefits. His commitment to her well-being had been both substantial and completely confidential. The successful treatment outcome represented not just medical good news, but validation of Jungkook's decision to invest personally in Dorothy's care. The phone call had confirmed that his support had contributed to a positive outcome for someone whose life had intersected meaningfully with his own. Mr. Jeon had been visiting Dorothy in the hospital whenever his schedule allowed. Her husband later shared privately with the security team. He never wanted any publicity about it, but he had been genuinely worried about her condition and had been asking for regular updates about her treatment progress. When we called with the good news, he was as relieved as we were. The additional information about Jungkook's hospital visits revealed the extent of his personal involvement in Dorothy's care and recovery. His regular presence during her treatment demonstrated a level of personal commitment that went far beyond financial support to include emotional investment and genuine relationship. The husband's description of Jungkook's concern and his request for regular updates painted a picture of someone who had been deeply invested in Dorothy's recovery process. His emotional response to the good news reflected months of worry and hope that had finally been resolved positively. The emphasis on Jungkook's desire to avoid publicity about his support efforts highlighted his preference for private generosity rather than public recognition. His approach to helping Dorothy had been motivated by genuine care rather than any desire for positive media attention or image benefits. David Rodriguez and the security team agreed to keep the incident completely confidential, understanding that Jungkook's emotional response had been motivated by personal care for someone he was helping privately rather than any situation that required public disclosure or media attention. The decision to maintain confidentiality protected both Jungkook's privacy regarding his personal charitable activities and Dorothy's medical privacy during her recovery process. The security team understood that their role was to protect rather than publicize such personal moments. The agreement among security personnel to keep the incident private reflected their professional understanding that personal emotional responses, even when captured on security footage, deserve protection when they don't involve security threats or public safety concerns. The private moment captured on internal security footage became a reminder to those who witnessed it that Jungkook carried deep personal concerns about individual people beyond his public responsibilities, and that his success hadn't diminished his capacity for caring genuinely about those whose lives had intersected with his in meaningful ways. The security footage remained confidential, never shared beyond the small group of people who needed to understand the context of Jungkook's emotional state for security purposes. The moment of profound gratitude and relief stayed private, as it should have, protecting both Jungkook's privacy and Dorothy's medical situation from unwanted public attention. The incident became a private reminder to security personnel about the human dimension of their work, protecting someone whose public responsibilities often overshadowed his personal relationships and private acts of compassion. The emotional moment had revealed character traits that enhanced rather than diminished their respect for his leadership. However, what happened next was completely unexpected and would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they understood about the entire situation. 3 days after the press conference incident, Dorothy Kim herself contacted David Rodriguez directly, requesting a private meeting to discuss something important about Jungkook's support that had not been fully disclosed. When Rodriguez met with Dorothy, she revealed information that completely changed his understanding of the situation and raised questions about the true nature of Jungkook's emotional response during the security footage incident. Her revelations suggested that the story about medical expenses and hospital visits was only part of a much more complex situation. "I need to tell you something about Mr. Jin's support that might help you understand why he was so emotional," Dorothy began, her voice carrying the weight of someone preparing to share something significant. "His help with my medical situation was real, but there were other aspects of our relationship that he may not have mentioned because he was trying to protect my privacy." The suggestion that there were undisclosed aspects of Jungkook's relationship with Dorothy immediately captured Rodriguez's attention, as it implied that the explanation for the emotional incident might be more complicated than he had initially understood. "I want to make sure you understand that Mr. Jeon's tears weren't just about relief over my recovery," Dorothy continued, seeming genuinely concerned about ensuring that Rodriguez had complete information. "There were personal feelings involved that made the news about my health particularly meaningful to him, and I think he may have simplified the explanation to protect both of us from unwanted attention." But then something completely unexpected happened. Instead of revealing romantic complications or inappropriate relationships, Dorothy began to applaud. The sound was gentle but sustained, and she stood up from her chair with obvious emotion and gratitude. "I wanted you to know," Dorothy said through her own tears, "that Mr. Jeon's emotional response was exactly what you would expect from someone who cares deeply about other people's well-being. His support saved my life, and his tears were the appropriate response of someone who had invested his heart in another person's recovery." The applause and emotional response from Dorothy transformed Rodriguez's understanding of the entire situation, revealing that instead of complications or hidden agendas, the story was actually about authentic human compassion and appropriate emotional investment in another person's well-being. As Dorothy continued to express her gratitude for Jungkook's support and her appreciation for the security team's discretion in handling the incident, it became clear that the emotional moment captured on security footage represented exactly what it had appeared to be: genuine relief and gratitude about positive news regarding someone he cared about deeply. The events of that week were never reported in the media, never discussed in any public forums, and never analyzed by industry leadership experts. The press conference, the emotional moment, and Dorothy's gratitude remained entirely private, shared only among the small group of people who had direct knowledge of the situation. Years later, the security team would remember the week when a routine press conference had been followed by a moment of profound human emotion that revealed the personal cost and emotional investment that accompanied Jungkook's private acts of generosity and compassion. But the most confusing aspect of the entire situation was Dorothy's decision to contact the security team directly to provide additional context about Jungkook's emotional response. Her initiative in reaching out suggested either concern about misunderstandings or a desire to ensure that his character was properly understood by those responsible for his security and well-being. Dorothy's contact with security had been completely unexpected and raised questions about how she had known about the incident in the first place. The security footage and Jungkook's emotional response had been kept strictly confidential, yet she seemed to have detailed knowledge of what had occurred in the private corridor. When questioned about her awareness of the security incident, Dorothy's explanation was vague and somewhat contradictory. She mentioned that Jungkook had told her about being emotional after receiving her husband's call, but her description of the incident included details that seemed more specific than what Jungkook would likely have shared about his private moment. The mystery deepened when Dorothy revealed that she had been watching the press conference live and had noticed something in Jungkook's demeanor during the final questions that suggested he was distracted or preoccupied. Her observation skills seemed remarkably acute for someone who was supposedly focused on her own medical recovery. "I could tell something was different about him during the last few minutes of the conference," Dorothy explained. "He was answering questions correctly, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was thinking about something else entirely. I knew my husband was planning to call him with the test results, so I suspected the timing might be related." Dorothy's ability to detect subtle changes in Jungkook's behavior during a televised press conference raised questions about the depth of their relationship and her familiarity with his emotional patterns. Her insight suggested either exceptional perceptiveness or a closer personal connection than had been initially described. The conversation with Dorothy revealed additional details about Jungkook's support that had not been mentioned in his original explanation to security. She described regular text message exchanges about her treatment progress, late-night phone calls when she was having difficulty sleeping due to medication side effects, and personal visits that had extended far beyond brief check-ins. "Mr. Jeon wasn't just helping with medical expenses," Dorothy continued. "He was providing emotional support throughout my entire treatment process. He would call to check on my mood, send encouraging messages before difficult procedures, and even arranged for special meals to be delivered when I couldn't keep regular food down. The level of personal involvement that Dorothy described painted a picture of someone who had been deeply invested in every aspect of her recovery process. Jungkook's emotional response to the good news began to seem not just appropriate, but perhaps even restrained, given the extent of his personal investment in her well-being. Dorothy's gratitude extended beyond appreciation for financial assistance to recognition of emotional support that had sustained her through months of uncertainty and fear. Her description suggested that Jungkook's tears represented the culmination of a long journey of shared hope and worry that had finally reached a positive resolution. "What people don't understand about Mr. Jane," Dorothy said with obvious emotion, "is that his success hasn't made him forget what it's like to be vulnerable and afraid. When I was going through the worst of my treatment, he never made me feel like I was bothering him or taking time away from more important things." The insight into Jungkook's character during Dorothy's illness revealed someone who had maintained genuine human connection despite the enormous demands of his professional responsibilities. His ability to provide consistent emotional support while managing multiple commitments demonstrated remarkable personal capacity for caring about individual welfare. Dorothy's final comments about the security incident focused on ensuring that Jungkook's emotional response was understood as evidence of his authentic humanity rather than any kind of weakness or professional vulnerability that might require concern or special handling. "Those tears you saw were exactly what you would hope to see from someone who had invested his heart in another person's recovery," Dorothy concluded. His emotional response was the appropriate reaction of someone who genuinely cares about other people's lives and well-being. Whatever her complete motivation for the contact, the week had revealed something important about the relationship between public responsibilities and private emotional investments, and about the human cost of caring deeply about individual people while maintaining professional composure and leadership responsibilities. The week's events faded quietly into the background of Jungkook's busy schedule. But for the people directly involved, the security team, Dorothy and her family, the memory lingered with a quiet significance. Rodriguez, though relieved that there had been no threat or scandal, found himself replaying the images from the security footage in his mind. The rawness of Jungkook's emotion was unlike anything he had seen in his years of protecting public figures. Most artists and executives maintained rigid control over their private moments, even when they thought they were alone. But Jungkook's breakdown had been unguarded, uncalculated, and profoundly human. For the security team, it was a reminder that their role went beyond guarding physical safety. It extended into the unseen territory of emotional well-being, moments of vulnerability that could not be handled with protocols or surveillance. Dorothy, meanwhile, recovered steadily. Her treatments concluded successfully, and she resumed a semblance of normal life, though she remained on medical leave. Every so often, she would send Jungkook a simple text update, sometimes a photo of her family, sometimes just a message of thanks. Jungkook always replied, never with grand words, but with the steady reassurance of someone who truly meant it when he said, "I'm here for you." Months passed. The Hybe building hosted countless other press conferences, each one blending into the routine of media coverage and public appearances. To the journalists, Jungkook remained the consummate professional, poised, articulate, seemingly unaffected by the relentless scrutiny of fame. But to Rodriguez, and a few others, there was now a layer beneath that surface, an awareness that behind the rehearsed answers and polished stage presence lived someone who carried the quiet weight of other people's battles. The security footage of that day was never erased, but it was sealed away in a secure digital archive, accessible only to a handful of authorized personnel. Not because there was any legal requirement to keep it, but because, for those who had seen it, the video had become more than just a record of an incident. It was a testament to the cost of caring. Rodriguez sometimes wondered if Jungkook ever thought about that moment, if he remembered leaning against the wall in that private corridor, phone still warm from the call, tears streaming without restraint. He suspected that Jungkook did remember, but not with embarrassment. Probably with the same mixture of exhaustion and relief that had been written all over his face that day. One rainy afternoon nearly a year later, as Rodriguez was reviewing building security reports, a small envelope was delivered to his desk. There was no return address, just his name in neat handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. Jungkook, wearing a baseball cap and mask, standing beside Dorothy in a quiet park, both smiling at the camera, There was no note, only a date written on the back, the day Dorothy had been officially declared cancer-free. Rodriguez kept the photo in his desk drawer, never showing it to anyone else. To him, it was the closing chapter of a story no one else would ever know in full. A story about compassion given quietly, about the burdens carried in silence, and about the moments when even the strongest people allow themselves to break. And somewhere in the layers of Jungkook's carefully maintained public life, there remained a truth invisible to most, that the man who could command a stadium of thousands with a single note was also capable of standing in a silent corridor, phone in hand, breaking down over the recovery of one person who mattered to him. It was a truth that needed no headlines, no applause, and no public recognition. It lived in the private knowledge of a few, sealed away like the security footage, not because it was a secret, but because it was sacred. But the story did not end there. Several weeks after Rodriguez received the photograph, he was approached in the Hive lobby by a staff member from the communications department. They mentioned, almost in passing, that Dorothy had been seen in the building again not as a visitor to Jungkook, but meeting privately with one of the company's senior executives. No one knew what the meeting was about, and it wasn't listed on the official schedule. It struck Rodriguez as unusual. Dorothy had no current professional role at Hive, and her medical leave status had not changed. Her visits to the building should have required prior clearance, yet she had been waived through security as if her arrival was expected. When Rodriguez quietly checked the visitor logs, he found something even more curious. This was not Dorothy's first unannounced visit. She had come 3 times in the last 2 months, each time staying less than an hour, always meeting behind closed doors, and always leaving without speaking to Jungkook in public. Rodriguez considered asking Jungkook directly, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of Jungkook's expression in that private corridor, or the knowledge that whatever bond they shared was deeper and more complex than even Dorothy had admitted. A week later, Rodriguez received another envelope, this one without handwriting, just a plain white slip tucked under his office door. Inside was a small USB drive. No explanation, no signature. When he plugged it into his secure workstation, he found a single video file, the security footage from that day in the private corridor. The same footage he had personally archived and locked away. It was identical, except for one difference. In this version, the audio from the phone call was clear. He heard Jungkook's voice breaking, the tremor in his breath, and then the voice on the other end, Dorothy's husband, delivering the news about her recovery. But there was something else. A moment of hesitation in the call, and then Dorothy's voice quietly cutting in, as if she had taken the phone mid-sentence. Her words were faint but unmistakable. "There's more I need to tell you, but not here." Rodriguez paused the playback and leaned back in his chair, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down. The security footage had always been a closed chapter in his mind, a private moment explained and understood. Now, it felt like an open door to a room he wasn't meant to enter. He never told Jungkook about the USB drive, and somewhere in the quiet corridors of the Hive building, behind locked doors and confidential meetings, the rest of the story remained waiting for a day when someone might decide that it was time for the truth to be told. For months, Rodriguez kept the USB drive locked in a separate drawer, telling himself he would eventually delete it. But the unanswered question, what else did Dorothy need to tell Jungkook, lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. Life at Hive moved on. Jungkook continued his work albums, concerts, international tours. On stage, his voice carried the same power. In interviews, his composure never wavered. But Rodriguez, watching from the edges, began noticing something subtle. Every time Dorothy's name came up in private conversations, in a quiet update from her husband, or in rare moments when she dropped by the building, Jungkook's gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if measuring every word, as if guarding something deeper than gratitude. Then one evening, nearly 6 months after the USB appeared, Rodriguez received a text from an unknown number. "If you want to understand that day, meet me at the coffee shop across from Seongbuk Park, alone, tomorrow, 8 p.m. The next night, the coffee shop was nearly empty. In the farthest booth, Dorothy sat with a scarf wrapped around her neck and a worn canvas bag at her side. She didn't smile when he approached. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said quietly. Rodriguez sat across from her, his security instincts on high alert. "You sent me the USB?" She nodded, eyes fixed on the table. "I couldn't just let it stay buried. You have to understand, Jungkook's tears that day weren't only about me surviving. They were about a promise. One he's been keeping for years. She opened her bag and slid a small envelope toward him. Inside were photocopies, medical reports, yes, but also old handwritten letters. Rodriguez skimmed them, realizing quickly they weren't from Dorothy. "They're from my sister," she said. She was someone Jungkook knew before I ever met him. She worked backstage at one of his earliest tours. She passed away 5 years ago. Rodriguez looked up sharply. "And the connection?" Dorothy took a breath, her voice trembling. "Before she died, my sister made Jungkook promise that if anything ever happened to me, anything, he would be there. Not as a celebrity, not as a colleague, as family." It was the kind of promise, Rodriguez realized, that could bind someone far deeper than professional loyalty. Dorothy leaned in. "That's why he reacted like that." Yes, he was relieved I'd survive. But it was also the moment he knew he had kept his word to her. Rodriguez sat back, the pieces sliding into place. The hospital visits, the personal expenses, the emotional investment, they weren't just acts of kindness. They were the fulfillment of a vow made in a quiet moment years before, one that no one else had ever heard. As they left the coffee shop, Dorothy paused under the dim streetlight. "Don't tell him I told you. He doesn't do these things for recognition. He does them because when he makes a promise, he keeps it." Rodriguez nodded. He understood now why the footage had always felt different. Why the emotion in that corridor had carried a weight he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just relief. It was the closing of a chapter that had begun long before anyone else was watching. But as he walked away, a new thought unsettled him. If Dorothy had kept this secret for so long, what else was still hidden? Because some promises, he realized, don't end when they're kept. They simply change shape and keep pulling on the heart of the one who made them. 2 weeks passed before Rodriguez heard from Dorothy again. This time, it wasn't a text or an envelope slipped under a door. It was a phone call. Short and urgent. "I think you should see something," she said. "But you'll need to meet me somewhere safe. Somewhere no one from the company will notice." They met in a small reading room at an old public library in Mapogu. The kind of place where conversations disappeared into the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional sound of pages turning. Dorothy was already there, a thin folder on the table in front of her. Without a word, she slid it toward him. Inside were photographs, grainy, slightly faded, of a much younger Jungkook. He couldn't have been more than 16, wearing simple street clothes, standing beside a makeshift stage in what looked like a rural school gymnasium. "Where was this?" Rodriguez asked, turning one of the photos over. "Daegu," Dorothy said. "It was a benefit concert. My sister organized it not for publicity, but to raise money for the local clinic. Jungkook wasn't famous yet. He volunteered because the clinic had helped treat someone in his family when they couldn't afford it." Rodriguez's eyes scanned the images. There was Jungkook, carrying heavy audio equipment, laughing with children, singing into an old microphone without any cameras around. Dorothy pointed to one picture where a little girl clung to Jungkook's hand. "That's me," she said softly. "I was 11. I had pneumonia that year. That clinic saved my life. My sister told Jungkook about it, and he promised her in that gymnasium, right after the show, that if our family ever needed help again, he'd be there." Rodriguez froze. The promise hadn't started 5 years ago. It had begun a decade earlier, when Jungkook was still a boy himself. "That's why it was more than relief in that corridor," Dorothy continued. "It was the weight of 10 years finally lifting off his shoulders. He'd carried that promise through his rise to fame, through world tours, through everything, and he never told anyone." Rodriguez closed the folder slowly, feeling the gravity of what he'd learned. He understood now that Jungkook's act of kindness wasn't a sudden burst of generosity or a moment of impulse. It was the continuation of a thread woven through his entire adult life, anchored to a promise made in a dusty school gym when nobody knew his name. Dorothy leaned back, her eyes tired but certain. "You see why this can't be in the headlines. People think they know him because they see him under lights and cameras. But the truth of who he is lives in moments like that. Quiet, unseen, and kept." Rodriguez nodded, but a question still burned in his mind. "Why tell me now?" She hesitated, then said, "Because someday you might have to decide whether to protect him from the world or show the world the man they never really saw. As Rodriguez walked out of the library into the cold evening air, he realized something unsettling. The story of that corridor wasn't just about compassion or promises kept. It was about a part of Jungkook's life that had been built in shadows, away from the eyes of the public, and maybe even away from the understanding of those closest to him. And now that Rodriguez knew, he wasn't sure whether he'd been given a gift or a burden. It began with a headline. Rodriguez was at his desk scanning the morning news when an entertainment gossip site splashed a grainy photo across its homepage. Jungkook in a quiet Seoul neighborhood, wearing a hoodie and mask, carrying a bag of groceries. The headline read, "Who is Jungkook secretly visiting? Fans spot idol in mysterious late-night errand." The article speculated wildly, a secret relationship, a hidden apartment, a potential scandal. But Rodriguez knew the location instantly. It was Dorothy's building. Within hours, other outlets picked up the story. Photographers were now camped outside the complex, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever Jungkook was visiting. Rumors spread like wildfire on social media. That afternoon, Rodriguez's phone buzzed. It was Jungkook. His voice was calm, but tight. "They've found her place. She's getting calls. People are asking questions she can't answer. Do you want me to step in?" Rodriguez asked. A pause. Then, "Not yet. If we push back, it becomes a bigger story. But if this doesn't die down in a few days, we might have to tell them something." Rodriguez's mind went immediately to the folder in his desk, the photographs, the letters, the proof of a promise that had spanned a decade. He knew that if the public understood the history, the rumors would vanish overnight. Jungkook's visits wouldn't look like a scandal. They'd look like a man keeping his word. But Dorothy's words at the library came back to him. "You see why this can't be in the headlines." 3 days later, things escalated. A paparazzi video surfaced showing Jungkook helping Dorothy out of a taxi, her scarf slipping to reveal her face. The clip went viral within hours. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Was she a relative? A secret partner? A former colleague? That evening, Rodriguez received a message from a journalist he trusted, one who had covered Jungkook fairly in the past. The message was simple. "I know there's more to this. Off the record, tell me why he's protecting her." Rodriguez stared at the screen. He had the power to end the speculation, to shield Jungkook and Dorothy from the relentless noise. But it meant revealing the story Jungkook had kept hidden for half his life. Later that night, he met Jungkook in the empty rehearsal hall, the sound of rain tapping against the high windows. "They're not going to stop," Rodriguez said. "We either say nothing and hope it burns out, or we tell them the truth." Jungkook looked at the floor for a long moment. "The truth isn't mine to tell." Rodriguez understood immediately. Jungkook was protecting more than his own privacy. He was protecting the memory of the girl in the faded photograph, the promise made in that gym, and the life that had grown from it. So Rodriguez made the choice for him. The next morning, a statement went out from Jungkook's agency. "This is a private matter concerning someone Mr. Jeon has known for many years. Out of respect for her privacy and her family, we will not be commenting further." The rumors didn't vanish, but slowly, as other stories claimed the headlines, the noise faded. The photographers moved on. Dorothy's building was quiet again, and the folder in Rodriguez's desk stayed locked, its contents untouched, a silent record of a promise kept, of a story the world would never fully know. But deep down, Rodriguez knew the peace wouldn't last. Secrets, no matter how noble, had a way of resurfacing when least expected. 5 years passed. In that time, Jungkook's career soared higher than ever. Sold-out stadium tours, record-breaking albums, humanitarian awards. The corridor incident had faded into obscurity, known only to a handful of people. Dorothy's health remained strong, though she kept a low profile, avoiding events and interviews entirely. Rodriguez had settled into a quiet rhythm as head of Jungkook's security. But he never forgot the folder in his desk, or the promise it represented. He also never forgot how easily a single photograph had almost shattered the privacy they fought to protect. Then, one spring morning, the news broke. Local music teacher hospitalized after hit, and run former BTS member seen at scene. Rodriguez's stomach tightened as he read further. The music teacher was Dorothy. She'd been walking home from an evening class when a speeding car had struck her. Witnesses reported that Jungkook himself had arrived minutes later, kneeling beside her until the ambulance came. Someone had filmed it from across the street. By noon, the video was everywhere. The rain-slicked road, the flashing ambulance lights. Jungkook holding an umbrella over Dorothy's stretcher with one hand, while gripping her hand with the other. That afternoon, Rodriguez visited him at the hospital. Dorothy was in surgery. Her condition was serious, but stable. Jungkook sat in the waiting room, still in the same clothes from the night before. His hair damp, his expression unreadable. "They're outside again," Rodriguez said quietly. "Reporters. They know it's her. They'll start digging." Jungkook exhaled, slowly. "I know." Rodriguez hesitated, then spoke. "If we tell them now the real story, it ends the speculation forever. You've kept this promise for over a decade. Maybe it's time they knew why." For a long moment, Jungkook didn't answer. Then he said, "If I do this, it's not for me. It's for her sister. And for Dorothy, so she doesn't have to carry the weight of explaining it anymore." The next day, a press conference was arranged at the hospital's media room. Cameras crowded the space, the air thick with curiosity. Jungkook stepped up to the podium. No stage lights, no rehearsed performance. Just him, in a plain shirt, eyes steady. "Some of you have seen the videos, and you're asking who Dorothy Kim is to me," he began. "She's someone I've known since I was a teenager. Someone whose family helped me before I had anything to give back. Years ago, I made a promise to her sister that if Dorothy ever needed me, I would be there. Last night was one of those times." He paused, the room silent. "This isn't a headline. It's not a scandal. It's not something I've hidden because I'm ashamed. It's something private because it belongs to her, to her family, and to a memory I've carried for most of my life. I'm telling you this now so she doesn't have to answer questions while she's fighting to recover." When he stepped away from the podium, there were no follow-up questions, just a heavy, quiet respect. Outside the hospital, fans gathered not to pry, but to leave flowers and letters for Dorothy. News anchors spoke of loyalty and compassion rather than mystery and gossip. For once, the full story had reached the public without being twisted. That night, Rodriguez stood alone in his office, the folder open on his desk for the first time in years. The photographs, the letters, the faded memories, all of it was out there now, in Jungkook's own words. And instead of destroying the promise, it had strengthened it. For the first time, Rodriguez allowed himself to think that maybe some secrets, when told at the right moment, didn't lose their power. They simply became part of the legacy